Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. My name is Tim, and this is So You Want Me to Believe. Sorry, I couldn't help myself with that one. If you didn't understand that reference, you probably haven't watched Tiger King on Netflix yet. And if you're staying inside like you're supposed to be, then you have plenty of time to do that. So go do that. Anyway, welcome back for another episode. Just quickly before I get started here, I wanted to mention that I now have some merch available through a big cartel store online. It's a pretty small selection of things. I have t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, hats, and bags right now. I can expand upon that, but until I see interest in purchasing any of those things, that's all that's going to be available for now. If you are interested in checking it out, click on the Linktree link in the show notes, and you'll find the link to the store at the very bottom of the page. In addition to this, I'm currently offering a code for 10% off a t-shirt from the store for anyone who's interested. All you need to do is give me a 5-star rating along with a review on Apple Podcasts, screenshot it, and email it to me at sywmtbpod@gmail.com. Once I've received that from you, I will reply to your email with your code. Also, I have something new I'd like to introduce to the show. In addition to my normal ads and whatnot, I'd like to include a podcast of the week or a personal recommendation from another good show to check out. I'll have 2 for you this week, so make sure you check those guys out and support other creators. For this week's Weird History Fact, I actually want to talk about something I get questions and weird looks about a lot. For anyone who knows me personally, I'm a huge fan of tattoos. I don't really look like the kind of guy you'd expect to have tattoos, but I really love them. One of the tattoos I have is on my right upper arm and shows a dog staring into a gramophone, but outside in the snow. I love this tattoo, but I get a lot of questions and weird looks about it because it does seem like an odd image if you don't know what it is. So I'm going to post a picture on my Instagram of the original picture next to the picture of the tattoo so that you can see what I'm talking about. So this image is actually titled Dog Chris Listening to the Gramophone, Antarctica, and was taken by a man by the name of Herbert Pointing in 1911. Now, I've mentioned before, I'm a huge fan of history. I studied history in college, and I volunteer for the local history museum. But I was also a music minor in college. I played the saxophone for 18 years, and I absolutely love dogs. I have a beagle named Moose that is actually begging me to play with her right now. So I chose this specific image because it includes all of those aspects. It's an historical image, there's a dog in it, and the gramophone suggests music. I thought this was a pretty neat way to show a variety of interests in one image. But I didn't just choose this image as a visual representation of a historical fact. It is that, but I also found the story behind it to be pretty interesting. This photo was actually taken as an advertising agent to sell gramophones during the Terra Nova expedition that took place from 1910 to 1913. This was a research expedition to Antarctica led by a British naval officer by the name of Captain Robert Falcon Scott. The purpose of this expedition was to research the Antarctic, which at the time was practically uncharted, by surveying the land while also carrying out meteorological, oceanographic, geological, biological, and physical investigations and researches. But that wasn't Captain Scott's only interest. The Terra Nova expedition was actually a continuation of the Discovery expedition to Antarctica a few years prior, from 1901 to 1904. When Scott became aware that the members of the Discovery expedition had just narrowly failed to reach the geographic South Pole, he wanted to make it his mission to be the first to actually make it there. So that's just a little background on the expedition itself. And while the story of the expedition is really interesting and definitely worth reading up on if you're interested in that kind of thing, I'm not so much interested in the facts of the actual expedition. In all actuality, the expedition itself was incredibly tragic, and recently there seems to be some debate about Scott's decision-making and whether the whole thing could have been prevented, but I'll let you look that up on your own if you want. What I really want to talk about is this image in particular and why it was taken. The image may look familiar to you if you go to look at it. It's reminiscent of another, much more famous image that you may or may not be familiar with. I'll post this one on Instagram too so you can see what I'm talking about. But the image I'm referencing now is a painting titled His Master's Voice by a British artist by the name of Francis Barrard, done in 1899. This painting also shows a dog staring into a phonograph. If you're not familiar with what these objects are, a gramophone is similar to a record player. It uses a flat spinning disc to play sound. A phonograph is also similar to that, but uses a spinning cylinder to produce sound. The cylinders were essentially early forms of records, but were initially made of wax before eventually their production evolved into using hard plastic. What this image actually depicts, though, is a dog, a terrier named Nipper, reacting to hearing a cylinder of his master's voice. Nipper was actually owned by Barad's brother, Mark, who had passed away. Barad inherited Nipper after his passing, along with some recordings of Mark's voice. He played those recordings to Nipper and noticed his reaction of hearing his voice coming from the phonograph. He was fascinated by that reaction and decided to depict the scene in a painting. However, the image you're probably used to seeing does not depict a phonograph, but actually shows a gramophone with a spinning record. This is because Barad could not convince any phonograph companies to use the image in their advertising, but a man by the name of William Barry Owen did express interest in using it for his company logo. Owen was the co-founder of the Gramophone Company, an English company that was one of the first of its kind. Owen offered to purchase the rights of the painting from Barad under the condition that he modify the image to depict one of his gramophones instead of the phonograph. So jumping ahead a few years, when Captain Scott was looking to embark on the Terra Nova expedition, he was in need of sponsorship. And although the Gramophone Company was still very young, they recognized that there was an incredible opportunity to market and promote their brand by aligning themselves with the expedition. They decided to become a sponsor and provided Captain Scott with 2 HMV Monarch gramophones to take with him on his travels. The gramophones were engraved on the side and said the words Captain Scott's Antarctic Expedition 1910. It may seem like a strange thing to take with them on a trip to Antarctica, but in all actuality, the explorers were going to be spending 2 years in isolation with very little entertainment, so having a gramophone was important to the crew in order to maintain a connection to society and their sanity. But obviously the Gramophone Company had a financial motive behind this as well. They didn't just give the crew the gramophones for entertainment purposes, although they were free to use them how they pleased. But ultimately, the goal was to procure an image they could market that included the gramophones on the expedition. So, Herbert Ponting, the photographer hired to capture moments from the expedition on film, was tasked with using the gramophones and the huskies that were brought along to guide the crew on their journey to recreate the now famous Gramophone Company logo, which we know is an altered version of Barad's painting titled His Master's Voice. Honestly, I'm not super clear on whether or not the Gramophone Company ever actually used the images taken as advertising, since the Terra Nova expedition led to a tragic end. From what I understand, they were not used, but I could be wrong on that. But the image lives on and is often used as a visual representation of the expedition. Pretty neat, right? If you don't already know, Patreon is an online membership platform that provides business tools for creators to run a subscription content service. It allows subscribers or patrons to help creators to continue producing content while offering exclusive rewards and perks for their support. The link to my Patreon page is www.patreon.com/sywmtbpod. There are 3 tiers, each with their own set of incentives. If you'd like to check those out, follow that link to the page and they're listed there for you. If you do like the show, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. Everyone who subscribes not only gets exclusive content, but it goes a long way in helping me produce the show. Any support is greatly appreciated. I also want to plug Buzzsprout. I don't have enough of a listener base to get an actual sponsor, so to be clear, Buzzsprout is not sponsoring this show. But they are a great service that offers content creators affiliate partnerships, so I do want you to know about them. Buzzsprout is a podcast hosting service that allows creators to put the content they make out into the world. If you've ever been interested in starting your own podcast, like I'm doing now, Buzzsprout is an excellent resource to help you achieve that goal. Following the link in the show notes lets Buzzsprout know I sent you, gets you a $20 Amazon gift card if you sign up for a paid plan, and helps support the show. I use Buzzsprout, and it's really helped make putting out the podcast an easy task. Buzzsprout offers a lot of useful and convenient features, like tons of guides to help you find the right equipment at the right price, getting your show listed in every major podcast platform, and by providing a great-looking podcast website that includes audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and more. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners. The team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed. So join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. The first podcast I want to recommend to you is the Queers for Fears podcast. This show is hosted by 2 friends, Abby and Ellie, who talk about, as they put it, creepy shit in each episode. The two of them are really funny, have a good banter, and their cases are not only incredibly interesting, but very well researched. I highly recommend checking this one out. They're only a couple episodes in, but what they've produced so far is incredibly interesting. Here's a short clip of their most recent episode.
If you want, we can do a Bridgewater Triangle episode.
The giant snakes episode. Are they like flying giant snakes? Is there any reason to suspect that they're not? That they're paranormal giant snakes?
I think there is something. Like, they must be so large that it just doesn't make sense.
Lovecraftian nightmares, Massachusetts.
So Freetown Fall River State Forest is within this Bridgewater Triangle. It's also known as the Cursed Forest of Massachusetts.
There's only more great content where that came from, so go check them out. Again, that's the Queers for Fears podcast, and I have posted their link tree in the show notes where you can find them. The second podcast I want to recommend is called The Shit Show. This show is hosted by Teresa and Sarah, who are two moms discussing cases local to the communities in which they've lived, whether that be their current location of central New York or from one of their hometowns in Illinois and New England. This show is also brand new and is just finding its footing. They are just one episode in at the time of my recording, so you can catch them while they're fresh and follow along each week while they grow. The cases they discuss in their first episode are crazy and really entertaining, so I would encourage you to listen to this one as well. Here's a clip from their first episode.
He stabbed him with a machete, with like a pocket knife.
A machete?
A machete. Whatever, like, all of the articles said weapons of opportunity. So whatever he could find in the garage, I guess, he attacked them.
Okay. That makes more sense. I'm picturing him walking 4 miles, like just with a machete, totally casual.
Right, no. So he, I don't think, had it with him. He did have a pocket knife with him, which he also used.
If you liked what you heard in that clip, they have more content coming your way soon, so go check them out. Again, this podcast is titled The Shit Show. A link to their show can also be found in the show notes. For this week's topic, I want to talk about the mysterious disappearance of Jack Don Lewis in 1997, which was a focal point of one of the episodes of the Netflix series Tiger King. If you've seen the show, then you're somewhat familiar with this case. And even if you haven't, I'm sure you've seen the memes focusing around accusations that Don's wife Carol was responsible for his disappearance. The docuseries focuses on this tragic event in a way that leads the viewer to believe, without a doubt, that Carol Baskin was the culprit behind Don's disappearance. But this is an incredibly one-sided telling of the situation, albeit an incredibly convincing one. We've seen things like this in other Netflix documentaries, specifically in Making a Murderer, where the producers only show facts and footage that show Stephen Avery in an innocent light. But the truth is, there's more to both of these stories. So today I want to focus on Don's story and whether or not Carol had any involvement in his disappearance. So first I want to start with the docuseries. The main character of the series, Joe Exotic, talks about the case quite a bit throughout the show. But they focus the entirety of episode 3 around it, and that's where I got a lot of the information I'm going to discuss here. But as I mentioned, there's a lot more to the story, so I'm also going to reference a few other sources, specifically a People article written by journalist Pam Lambert in 1998, as well as Carol's own words as written on her website for Big Cat Rescue. You can find links to both of those things in the show notes as well. The docuseries interviews a variety of people about the case. There are accounts from Mark McCarthy, a man who really had no connection to the case but also runs a big cat sanctuary, Gladys Lewis Cross, Don's ex-wife, Linda Sanchez and Gail Rathborn, Don's daughters, Ann McQueen, Don's executive assistant, Wendell Williams, one of Don's former business associates, and Joseph Fritz, Carol and Don's attorney. There are a few other people along the way in the episode, but those are the main people I'm going to focus on. Carol Baskin and Joe Exotic were also interviewed, obviously, but Joe has no connection to the actual disappearance case, and I'm going to discuss Carol's viewpoints later. And while Joe was the main character of the show, I have very little interest in that man altogether, and I don't want to discuss him in relation to this case. This case is kind of hard to get a clear understanding of if you simply go off of what was discussed in the show. Some important details are there, but they seem to be told in a way that is pretty misleading. So I'm going to talk through the show's telling of the case, and we'll dive into the logistics of everything later. At the start of the third episode, Mark McCarthy says that Don Lewis had mentioned to him about a month prior to his disappearance that he feared his life was in danger. A majority of the portrayals in the show focus on Don as a somewhat eccentric, wealthy man who had reason to believe that Carol was out to get him. All of the people interviewed in the show expressed concern about Carol's involvement in the case, except for the attorney, that is. Gladys claims that she had spoken with Don about divorcing Carol, saying she was a terrible and dangerous person. Both of his daughters agreed that Carol was dangerous and that Don was afraid of her. and Anne even provides actual evidence that Don was worried about his safety around Carol. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Carol says her and Don met when she was 20 years old in 1981, and Don would have been 33. Carol had just been in a big fight with her then husband, Michael, and was walking barefoot down the street. Don happened to be driving down that very street when he saw Carol, pulled over, and asked her if she would get in the truck. Now, I don't know the circumstances around that. Maybe he was just offering a ride to someone who seemed distraught, but based on what happens next, that seems doubtful. Either way, when a stranger pulls over and asks you to hop in when you aren't actively seeking a ride, your initial response is probably going to be a little creeped out, and you're going to refuse the invitation, right? I mean, as we learned in episode 6 when discussing the Ying Zhang case, it's probably not a great idea to get into the car with a stranger offering a ride. So, naturally, Carol refused the ride, but Don was persistent and drove around 2 more times trying to convince Carol to get in the truck. The third time he did so, Carol said she looked down and there was a gun in the front seat. He told her that he just needed someone to talk to and that if it made her more comfortable, she could pick up the gun and hold it on him as they drove around. Carol agreed to this and did just that. Now, not to criticize her choices here, but that's a pretty risky move in my opinion. You don't know this guy, and now he's involved a gun? You don't even know if it's loaded in regards to your own protection, but also, why did he have a gun? What else did he have that he's not showing you, and what are his true intentions? Those would just be my thoughts, but maybe that gun intimidated her and she didn't feel she could say no at this time? I don't know, but she doesn't make that distinction in the show. Either way, she got into the truck with him and they drove off. She ended up staying the night with him that night and would form a relationship that led both of them to desert their current spouses and their children. In the show, Gladys talks about how she was still in love with Don and was shocked by his decision to leave her. She says she still loves him, and although she didn't outright say it, she definitely despises Carol. Now, according to the show, they tell a story that Don was always a very wealthy man, but that you couldn't tell it by looking at him. In the People article, they also mentioned that he always liked to carry around enough cash to buy a new airplane, but would buy all of his clothes at garage sales. Visually, it would seem that there was a comparison to Bill Gates in the way that you just wouldn't know how wealthy he was based on appearance. There's more to that though, and again, I'll get to that. But he was a very frugal man when it came to most things. In fact, the wedding ring he gave Carol only cost him $14. But he did amass quite a fortune and would use that money on things that seemed frivolous, like airplanes and exotic animals. However, for Don, the exotic animals seemed to be more of a business prospect than anything else. What is now known as the Big Cat Rescue was initially called Wildlife on Easy Street and was run by Don and Carol. It was on about 69 acres of land and was home to several big cats. At first, before the couple really knew what they were doing, they used Wildlife on Easy Street as an opportunity to buy, sell, and breed big cats. But Carol grew to not really like that idea and was more committed to using the property as a refuge for abused cats or cats who would otherwise have been put down. Her goal was to rescue these cats and ultimately help the wild population of big cats grow. It sounds like Don was in agreement with her on those terms for the most part, but he also saw the dollar signs associated with owning big cats and was adamant that they continue breeding and selling them. Don had purchased about 200 acres of land in Costa Rica for that purpose alone. Costa Rica had much less stringent laws about the breeding and selling of exotic animals and would provide him much more freedom to conduct business out of Costa Rica. So his plan was to move the entire operation out of Florida and down to Costa Rica where they could make much more money. And in fact, Don was in the process of actually doing this when he went missing. He made frequent trips out to Costa Rica and would be gone for days at a time, leaving Carol alone at Easy Street while he was gone. Carol says in the show that when he was gone, she would go out and have as many of the cats spayed and neutered as she could to prevent Don from breeding them. Now, they don't really talk about this much in the show, but if that's true, then that had to be a huge point of tension between the two of them. They do mention that Carol and Don would fight, although it sounds to me like that could have been exaggerated to push an agenda, but I can imagine this would genuinely be something worth actually arguing about. Carol thought it was wrong to breed the cats, and Don wanted to use them for profit. So to Carol, Don was doing something she found immoral. And to Don, Carol was messing up his business opportunities. With the cats no longer able to reproduce, they really no longer served any purpose for Don. That being said, though, Don did understand that they were living things, and that their very existence was endangered. I don't want to imply that Don was simply only using the cats for profit. To me, it sounds like Don thought the best way to preserve the species of cats was to have them reproduce in captivity and force the growth of the population. I think his intentions were good, but he also saw the promising business aspect to it as well. But I believe that was likely secondary to his interest in the lives of the cats. He still took care of the cats that were spayed and neutered, he just didn't agree with Carol's assertion that this was the wrong way to go about it. Carol grew to believe, and still believes, that saving these cats who were bred in captivity from the abuse they experienced or from the threat of death they were facing was of vital importance because they are living things and should be treated as such. But having been bred in captivity, these animals were not fit to be released into the wild. They simply wouldn't know how to survive in that environment because they had never had to live like that before. So her idea was to keep these animals happy and healthy under her watch at the rescue while promoting the protection of wild big cats so that their population can grow naturally. Because while breeding big cats in captivity would statistically raise the population of big cats in the world, that wouldn't be beneficial to the species itself because it's unnatural and they wouldn't be able to live the lives that they were put on this earth to lead. So while I believe both of them had their hearts in the right place, and I think they probably both understood where the other was coming from, this had to be a source of tension on their marriage. Later in the show, Anne introduces a document that she claims had been given to her by Don himself, saying that he told her if anything were to ever happen to him, she should give it to the police. The document was a restraining order that Don had filed against Carol with the courts, but was denied by a judge. In the restraining order, Don says, "This is the second time Carol has gotten angry enough to threaten to kill me. Carol and I got into a big fuss, and she ordered me out of the house or she would kill me. She has a .45 revolver and took my .357 and hid it." The judge denied the request for protection, saying there was no immediate threat to his life, possibly arguing that it was just hearsay. Joseph Fritz says that in his legal opinion, it was likely denied due to the protection of freedom of speech. She didn't actually do anything to him, she just threatened him, and you can't stop someone from saying something like that, you can only react to their actions. His daughters claim that Don didn't like to involve the police in anything though, so for him to go to the authorities on something like that was a big deal for him. They believe he truly thought his life was in danger. Carol, on the other hand, denies that she ever even threatened him, and honestly, I tend to believe her on this one. I'll talk more about why that is in a bit, but if you've seen the show, and after you hear Carol's version of the events, it's pretty clear that the producers didn't make their intentions clear to Carol, and she really didn't get a chance to defend herself on the show. She has her own theory as to why that is, but just in Carol's demeanor in the interviews, you can sort of tell that she wasn't aware of how this footage was going to be used. To me, it looks like they were asking her questions regarding Dawn just for some background information on how the big cat rescue came to be, and that's why she was talking so nonchalantly about aspects of the case. But when they changed the route of the series from being all about big cats and their lives in the backyard zoos to more of a true crime angle, they sort of manipulated the footage in a way that led the viewer to see Carol as some kind of sociopath who is clearly guilty and has no remorse for her actions. Now, I don't want to imply that I believe Carol had nothing to do with this. In fact, I don't know what I believe. There just isn't enough evidence to really form an opinion on what happened here. So I can't rule out the possibility that Carol was involved, but I do think the way the docuseries portrayed her was extremely unfair and intentionally misleading. After watching the show, there was no doubt in my mind that Carol was responsible for Dawn's disappearance. But after digging into the case some more for the purposes of this episode, I'm leaning more and more towards, you know what, maybe she didn't do it. But before I get into why that is, let me give you just a few more supposed facts of the case portrayed in the show. In the episode, Carol says the last thing Don had said to her was that he needed her to have his Costa Rica truck ready for him because he was leaving early the next morning. Anne, his assistant, says that he was planning to ship some cars down to Costa Rica and that everything had to be in Miami for him by Monday morning. She talks about how she was needing details of this trip from Don in order to have all the preparations ready for him on Monday. But according to her, she could not reach him all day Saturday or all day Sunday. So finally, she got a hold of Carol, who said she didn't know where he was and advised her to contact the police, which she then did. 2 days later, Don's van was found about 40 miles from the Easy Street property, abandoned at a private airport with the keys and his briefcase still inside, but Don was still nowhere to be found. According to Kenny Farr, who was Don's handyman, he says that the van was not inspected by the police at the airport, but was returned to the Easy Street property and was not looked at by investigators until 2 days after Carol had gotten a hold of the van. Now, they later talk about how they were able to find fingerprints in the van that belonged to Don's mechanic, so this information doesn't seem to be very accurate. If Carol had had the opportunity to clean up the van, how would she have been able to remove any evidence of her own presence but leave behind somebody else's fingerprints? I just don't see how that's possible. And that's just an inconsistency in the show itself. Carol points that out as well, but if you really think about it, did she really even need to say it? That line of thinking just doesn't make logical sense. So Don was planning to travel down to Costa Rica, and when he normally did so, he would fly commercial. Although Don did own airplanes himself, and although he was trained, he didn't have a valid pilot's license, which obviously didn't stop him from flying. He just wouldn't report his flights and would stay low enough not to be detected on any radar. But because of this fact, and the fact that his van was found at a private airport, there was a theory circulating that Don just hopped in a plane, flew down to Costa Rica, and started a new life without telling anyone. But Carol and Joseph Fritz both talk about this, and there's just no way he could have done that. The planes Don owned were fairly small, and they just wouldn't be able to hold enough fuel to make it all the way from Florida to Costa Rica. Not even close. Joseph estimated that he would have to refuel at least 4 times if he wanted to take a trip that distance, and obviously there would be nowhere to stop and refuel for him on the way to Costa Rica. I couldn't find any mention of this either, but wouldn't that idea be fairly easy to dispute? I would think all you would need to do is find out if any of his planes were missing. If the answer is no, then he probably didn't try to fly away into a new life, right? But I couldn't tell you if any of his planes were missing, I just couldn't find that information anywhere. But regardless, this theory seems to be a bust. There are other theories out there too, though. One theory, which Joseph suggests, is that he had gone out to buy a new plane, and while on a test flight, the current owner pushed Don out of the plane somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico. That's why his van was still there, and that's why there's no body and no witnesses. This theory has not been disproven, and it's a very possible explanation. But the focus of the show is not what could have happened to Don, it's what a majority of the people involved believe Carol did to Don. So the overall idea here is that Carol never really loved or even liked Don, but that she was just using him for his money. They've spun this whole conspiracy theory that Carol manipulated her way into controlling Don's will and estate after his disappearance, and that she essentially screwed his family out of his fortune in order to keep it all for herself. There's mention of the power of attorney documents and Don's will being altered somehow. Anne says Carol broke into her office and removed all copies of the original documents that listed Anne as the POA for both Don and Carol. And in the now legally binding POA, the very first line says, "This durable family power of attorney shall not be affected by any disability or disappearance." Now, even Carol admits that this is probably not super common wording for a POA. But once again, there's more to this story, even though the docuseries producers only give you the one side to base your opinions on. Gladys talks about Don's will a little bit, saying that Carol knew she couldn't enact anything in the will until Don was legally pronounced dead. She was under a conservatorship of the estate, limiting her access to funds necessary to run the rescue, and the family was viciously fighting over how Carol could use that money. Don would have to have been missing for 5 years before he could be legally pronounced dead and the will could be enacted. According to Gladys, Carol requested his death certificate 5 years and 1 day after his disappearance, which seems somewhat suspicious. That is, until you realize the conservatorship put her behind over $100,000 a year to care for all of the cats and to keep up the property, and she desperately needed access to that money. His daughters also say that Carol picked and chose what they would inherit from their father, only giving them the leftover junk that Carol didn't want. And in the show, Carol seemingly tried to explain this away by saying Don didn't want them to have anything at all, and that it was Carol that allowed them to get what they did receive. Now again, that's a true statement, but the way it was portrayed in the show was incredibly misleading. The biggest theory that has come out of the show was that Carol somehow killed Don, put his body through a meat grinder, and fed him to the cats. Now, they talk about how preposterous that theory is in the show, but they do it in a clever way that makes the viewer think, that sounds like the perfect crime, and she definitely did it. They talk about the evidence that would have been left behind, and follow that up with Joe Exotic talking about the acidity of a tiger's stomach contents, and how if you feed one a whole turkey, it digests everything, bones and all. They talk about the meat grinder, and how it's not plausible for a human body to have gone through the small one they had, and follow that up with the image of a huge meat grinder that was not an accurate representation of the one Carol and Don owned. They even go so far as to show Carol in a completely different episode, mentioning that the cats don't eat people, and that the only way she could think of to attract one of them to try and eat someone was to cover them in sardine oil. This was obviously not said in reference to Don, and I think the way they slyly included that soundbite in another episode was pretty shady and only served to perpetuate their agenda. Since Don's disappearance, there has been no funeral or memorial for him, and I suspect that's probably because the family cannot be gathered together and maintain composure. Carol has since remarried and continues to run wildlife on Easy Street, now known as the Big Cat Rescue, with her current husband. Now, Gladys and the daughters end by claiming that Carol sent them a cease and desist letter, telling them to stop doing interviews implying that Carol was involved. They say Carol told them she has the money, they don't, and they just need to get used to that fact. And that's probably true, but I would argue that it was a warning against slander, and money was their only real concern in the matter, and not what happened to Don. Regardless, the family still firmly believes that Carol was involved in Don's disappearance, or that she at least knows something about what happened to him. But now let's talk about Carol's side of the story, and some of the things they didn't mention in the docuseries. On March 31st, 2020, Carol made a lengthy and informative post on her website in response to the docuseries and their portrayal of her. A huge part of this involves Don, but there's also a lot to do with the portrayal of the big cat rescue too. And for those claiming that Carol is not different from Joe or the other backyard zoo operators, I would encourage you to check out her page. There really is a big difference there. So as I mentioned earlier, Carol did not know what the docuseries was going to become. Her understanding of the show was that it was intended to be like a big cat version of the documentary Blackfish, which exposed SeaWorld for its treatment of captive whales. And originally, that's what the whole thing was supposed to be. It wasn't until Joe was arrested that the focus of the documentary shifted, and you know that by the presence of actual face-to-face interviews with Joe. There's no way they could have known he was going to be arrested on murder-for-hire charges when they set out to make the series. That development turned the show into what it is now. And according to Carol, most of what is said in the show are lies and innuendos from people that aren't even credible, and she explains why that is. Seriously, this is a pretty impressive and convincing post. I highly recommend you check it out. She has links to legal documents and everything. She was prepared with the receipts on this one. Something I haven't talked about that Carol mentions in the show is Don's mental state leading up to his disappearance. I haven't talked about it because it's only briefly mentioned and immediately thrown out as plausible. But Carol says that Don was experiencing signs of dementia and believed he was in the early stages of Alzheimer's. She says that he was seen by a doctor who had diagnosed him with bipolar disorder and gave him a referral to have an MRI done of his brain. But he would never get the MRI done, and Carol didn't even know about it until after he disappeared and found the referral in his bedside table while looking for clues as to where he could be. Along the idea of some kind of mental illness, Carol says Don was just not in his right state of mind. He began refusing to use the bathroom in the house and began defecating outside. Carol even made an appointment for Don to be seen by that doctor again, but he would disappear before he got the chance to do so. Carol also says that Don was absolutely not a millionaire before she met him. She suspects that he was probably doing well for himself, and he definitely was not poor, but she's sure he wasn't a millionaire. Now, she's never seen any actual bank records, so she doesn't know what he was actually worth when they met, but she did not have the impression that he was worth millions of dollars, and so money was not part of her attraction to him. And in fact, Don made most of his fortune by flipping foreclosed real estate with Carol's help. This isn't something he began doing until after he and Carol had gotten together, and since Don couldn't read beyond a first grade level, Carol helped him with a big portion of it. I could be wrong on this too, but I don't believe they make mention of this fact in the series. I don't know why that would be something they would want to leave out, but they do show copies of the restraining order that Don filed, and there are some pretty bad spelling errors, so this is another thing I tend to believe Carol on. Carol then lists all of the reasons you can't trust the people interviewed on the show. She talks about Anne McQueen, Don's assistant. She says they caught Anne embezzling $600,000 in properties by buying them with their money and putting them in her own name. And Carol provides a copy of the case record in which they took Anne to court over this matter, so we can believe her on that one too. She also says Wendell Williams, Don's former business associate, was cheating Don. I don't know enough about the property issue she describes on the website, but she mentions something about misusing a property for which they were loaning him money, so that's one thing. And then she says she witnessed several times where Wendell would have Don sign documents, leading him to believe they were for the purpose of purchasing property. Remember, Don couldn't read and he trusted Wendell, so he would take his word for it and sign those documents. However, she discovered that Wendell was actually stealing from Don and had conned him out of over $60,000. She also says that Anne lied about the restraining order and that the whole thing was actually Wendell's idea. She says in Don's mental state, he would often buy a lot of junk at auctions that were just littering the property. So when he was in Costa Rica, she would haul a lot of that stuff away. When Wendell found out about this, he tried to call the police to stop her, who told him he would need a restraining order. So he contacted Don, who was furious that she was getting rid of his things, and he filed the restraining order claiming that his life was in danger. Whether the lie about her threatening his life was Don's idea or Wendell's idea is unclear to her, but she insists that it was in fact a lie. And she says that Anne was never given a copy of this by Don and told to give it to the police if something happened to him. She suspects that she knew about the restraining order and concocted a plan to use it against Carol after his disappearance. She backs it up by saying it took her several days to remember that she had the document, and he had only written it 2 months prior. How could something like that happened so recently just slip your mind for days? She even had something to say about Gladys and Dawn's daughters. Gladys claimed in the documentary that she was still in love with Dawn and was shocked by his leaving her for Carol. But Carol says otherwise. They even mention in the episode that Dawn had a wandering eye and could have been a sex addict. And Carol says Gladys knew about this, and this wasn't even close to the first time he had cheated on her. According to Carol, Gladys is the one who demanded they get a divorce, and only because there was another man she wanted to marry. She was done with Dawn and had moved on from him, but was still legally bound to him. And with the agreement for a divorce, Gladys agreed that they would only receive $1 million in assets if the divorce was quick. Carol says all parties agreed with this and everyone chose their assets, although Donna, one of the daughters, lost everything in the stock market. Later, Gladys filed a suit claiming she was entitled to more than the $1 million. Now, no one mentions this, but I believe that she probably just didn't know how much Dawn was worth when they divorced, and when she found out, she was upset that she had agreed to receive such a small portion, and believed that she was entitled to more since they were still married when he amassed that sum of money. But that did not go anywhere for her. Carol also thinks Dawn's daughters made up their alleged lies to get more money. She says everything the family got was left to them. Carol had nothing to do with choosing any of those assets. But it sounds like the daughters made up some story about Carol giving them the leftover junk just to make her seem malicious. She also believes that they made up the rumor about the meat grinder because they knew that if Carol was arrested in relation to the murder, she would no longer be in control of the estate and that they would be able to get more money out of it. But she also explains that the meat grinder the couple had wasn't anything big. It was a little tabletop meat grinder, and everything that went through it had to be cut up into little 1-inch pieces before going through it. It just wasn't that big or sturdy, and it definitely couldn't grind up bones. So not only is it probably not physically possible for this to be done, but can you imagine how long that would take? How would she be able to get away with an undertaking of that size without detection? She also explains the use of the word disappearance in the POA that the docuseries makes out to be some kind of conspiracy against Dawn. She says that their lawyer in Costa Rica had told them about people traveling to Costa Rica and disappearing, as there are some dangerous parts of Costa Rica. Well, Dawn had been lending money to the Helicopter brothers, who were like the Costa Rican version of the Mafia. So they included disappearance in the POA in case something went wrong on that end, which is another theory people have about Dawn's disappearance, by the way. Carol also talks about the van, saying it absolutely was investigated, and that the only reason the idea of him flying one of his planes came into the picture was because a caretaker at one of his Costa Rican properties claimed to have spotted him down there, and they found the van at the airport. No one ever believed he could make it down there, and the fact that they included that as a potential theory was kind of ridiculous. The list goes on, but the last two things I want to mention is that the majority of the other people interviewed in the series were exotic animal breeders and owners just like Joe Exotic. And since Carol was and is so invested in stopping the inhumane treatment of big cats, which would in turn have an effect on those people's businesses, they all have a vested interest in seeing her go under. In fact, that's her entire theory on why the series portrayed her in the way it did. A co-creator of the show, Eric Goode, is himself an exotic reptile enthusiast. At one point in time, Carol had helped in the passage of a bill that outlawed the private ownership of pythons in Florida, but was only involved because the bill would impose a bond of $10,000 on backyard big cat owners as insurance against any damage brought on by the escape of a cat. There was nothing like this prior to that bill's passage. She suspects that Eric might have portrayed her in this light because he went into the series knowing he didn't like her and wanted to see her stopped as well. This case still remains unsolved, and there's still an open investigation into the disappearance of Dawn Lewis. In fact, Sheriff Chad Chronister of Hollywood, Florida, is now actively investigating the case due to the renewed interest from the show and is seeking tips on the disappearance. I'm not going to plug his contact information because from what I understand, he's been flooded with tips already that have turned out to be bogus. But if you have real information on what happened to Dawn Lewis, his contact information is not hard to find. Alright, so that's all I have for you in this week's episode. What do you think happened to Dawn Lewis? There are so many theories here, so opinions could be all over the place. But after hearing Carol's side of the story, do you still think she's involved? Or are you more skeptical of her involvement like I am? Let me know what you think by sending me an email to sywmtbpod@gmail.com. Remember, I would eventually like to compile listener theories into an episode of its own, so I encourage you to send those theories my way. If you like this episode, don't forget to check out the other episodes I've already posted, and feel free to check out my Patreon page. The link is down in the show notes. And don't forget to follow me on social media. You can like me on Facebook. My page is titled So You Want Me to Believe Podcast. And you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is @SYWMTBpod on both platforms. Also, links to all of my social media can now be found in the link tree listed in the show notes. And if you did like this episode, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. Good ratings help other people find the show, and they just make me feel good inside. And if you didn't like the show, thanks for listening anyway, and I hope your poor life choices improve at some point. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode, and I will see you all again next week.